With spring training well underway and most of the team's free agent signings and trades already done, let's go back and look at every team's off-season and give them a grade for how they did. This range will go from A plus to F, with one team getting the lucrative A plus and one team getting the F. Everyone else will get somewhere in between, and we'll be sure to give our perspective on why they received that grade. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and let's go ahead and get into it. Starting off with the Milwaukee Brewers, they stayed very on brand this offseason, trading away Devin Williams to the New York Yankees in exchange for Nestor Cortez and Arizona Fall League legend Caleb Durbin, as well as letting Willy Adames, Frankie Montas, and others walk in free agency. They didn't do much in the form of signing players either, only grabbing two relievers in Tyler Alexander and Elvin Rodriguez. So not a really big offseason really to speak of at all. And this is coming from a team that just won their division the last season and saw a lot of teams within their own division improve this offseason. So for that, I gave them a D+. The Detroit Tigers, they had a pleasant offseason, making notable grabs in Gleyber Torres, Alex Cobb, Tommy Kahnle, Jack Flaherty, John Brebbia, and Jose Urquidy. These were additions that don't blow you away, but they are quality of life additions to the team. They did do well to lengthen out this rotation. Alex Cobb and Jose Urquidy probably won't help the rotation early on in the season. They're both on the IL right now, but Jack Flaherty is an excellent addition behind Tariq Skubal. For that, I gave them a B. For the Chicago White Sox, it's difficult for me to look at an offseason where you just trade everybody away or you let them walk in free agency and view it as a positive. But I think they did pretty much everything they needed to do. They maximized Garrett Crochet, got back two stud prospects in Kyle Teal and Braden Montgomery, as well as some MLB ready guys in Wikelman Gonzalez and Chase Meadroth, as well as signing a slew of one-year deals to guys like Josh Rojas, Austin Slater, Bryce Wilson, Mike Talkman, Michael A. Taylor. These are guys that give you MLB talent. They raise your floor a little bit as a team. They're not going to make you a playoff contender by any means, but they're having a good year or something. You trade them at the deadline. That's another prospect in the system. I gave them a C plus. They just kind of did what they needed to do. For the Yankees, it's a weird one for me because how do you justify saying they had a good offseason whenever they lost Juan Soto? I think if you look at it in total value lost, the additions do kind of offset that. Paul Goldschmidt, Max Fried, Devin Williams, Cody Bellinger. I think you could very arguably say they did well if you just looked at their losses as Juan Soto. But they did lose Gleyber Torres as well. Nestor Cortez, Clay Holmes, Tommy Kahnle. These are names. Like, they're not superstars like Juan Soto, but I think you're counting on a lot from Cody Bellinger and Paul Goldschmidt bouncing back in New York, whereas these guys have proven their talent there. And I just think that they lost a little bit too much value for me to be like, yeah, they had a great offseason. I think they did well to band-aid what they lost, but losing that much to me means you had a bad offseason. That's a C minus. Then you look at a team like the Angels, who maybe didn't make the upside additions that the Yankees did, but they also didn't lose nearly as much in their losses. So for that, I gave them a B. They did well to sign Yusei Kikuchi, who over his tenure with the Astros looked fantastic. You add in a guy like Jorge Soler, Travis d'Arnaud, even a guy like Yohan Moncada, Ryan Noda, Kenley Jansen. These are names that should boost the floor to this team very well. I'm not sure it's enough to get them into the playoffs or into that division hunt, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. And then you have the Houston Astros, who are finally seeing their dynasty come to an end, and this is the offseason that kind of feels like it cements that, or at least continues the trajectory the way it was going at the end of last year. You have Kyle Tucker getting traded away to the Cubs. Anytime you lose a top 10 player of the game, it should be viewed as a negative offseason. But then you jump on top of that and you add Yusei Kikuchi left, Ryan Presley, who's been a stalwart of this team, Alex Bregman, who was a very good player for this team for a long time. These are just excellent players that are leaving. Yes, you signed Christian Walker back. He's going to be great. Isaac Paredes, who you got back in the Kyle Tucker trade, probably fits Minute Maid Park pretty well. Cam Smith has looked great in the early portions of spring training, but I just think that you can't lose players like this and expect to have a good offseason. Again, kind of like the Yankees, they did get some players back that band-aid it, but definitely not a good offseason. I gave them a D. And then you had the Tampa Bay Rays, who stayed very on brand this offseason. They traded away Jeffrey Springs as their kind of headliner move, brought in Joe Boyle, who is a player that has talent and certainly feels like another Rays reclamation project, but we'll have to wait and see. Have to see if he can find the strike zone. Aside from that, you had Ha-Seong Kim come in late in the offseason, Danny Jansen and Eloy Jimenez, who should raise the floor of this team. Hopefully you can see Eloy finally get back to that form that we once saw. And this is pretty much a straight down the fairway type of offseason. Not anything special, but pretty solid all in all. We'll give them a C. And then if you keep it in perspective, the Athletics had a great offseason. You had Brent Rooker on a long-term extension. You have Lawrence Butler, long-term extension. You brought back TJ McFarland. Oh, by the way, you actually used money and signed some free agents this year. Luis Severino, 3-year deal. If you can get what he was getting with the Mets, I think you're happy. Jose Leclerc, Luis Urias, 1-year deals, brought him in. Oh, by the way, you got Jeffrey Springs, who, if you can get him healthy, we've seen him be excellent with the Rays. This is just a team that I think had a great offseason, especially if you keep in perspective what they normally do. I think the A's are actually setting them up pretty well next year. Maybe not division crowners yet, but they're headed in the right direction as an organization. And you had another subpar offseason coming from the Atlanta Braves. They did bring in Jerks and Profar kind of later into the offseason. That was a quality addition. Aside from that, you only signed Connor Gillespie and Brian De La Cruz. Not a great offseason in terms of additions. Other news, they did bring in Aaron Bummer and Ronaldo Lopez on extension, so that's good. Then you look at what they lost. Max Fried, Charlie Morton, Jorge Soler, AJ Minter, even a guy like Ramon Laureano and Travis d'Arnaud. These are impactful names to this team. And I just don't think they added a whole lot that really made this team better. And for that, I gave them a D+. I just don't think they did it a lot. And then another team you wish you could just poke with a stick and tell them, do something. Yeah, the Baltimore Orioles. Why have you not invested into this young team? You have the pieces coming up through the farm system, and that farm system is not as good as it once was now because they've all come up. They've all graduated for the most part. The time is now, and yes, they signed Tyler O'Neill. I like that addition. But aside from that, they did not improve. You actually probably lost more in free agency than you gained. You brought in Charlie Morton, Gary Sanchez, Andrew Kittredge, Dylan Carlson. What are we doing? We're trying to replace Corbin Burns and Anthony Santander. This is not an improvement for this team, and they just didn't commit the way they needed to and the way this new ownership group, you would assume, thought they would have. They got a C- from me. They probably deserve worse. And then you have the Toronto Blue Jays, who, if you escape the narrative that they didn't re-sign Vladimir Guerrero Jr., they did pretty well. I mean, they brought in Andres Jimenez, who the Guardians were looking to salary dump. Yimi Garcia is an excellent reliever. Same as Jeff Hoffman. It'll be interesting to note if he does have those issues that flared up during other teams' physicals. Anthony Santander coming off a great year. If he can come anywhere close to that type of player again, you got a great player. And then Max Scherzer on a prove-it deal. This is just a team that, yeah, it wasn't the premier names that just changed the course of a franchise. It wasn't a Juan Soto, but it was a very good offseason in my perspective towards building around Vladimir Guerrero Jr. You're still really dependent on Bo Bichette to bounce back in a big way. You're really dependent on a lot of players stepping up, but I think it did raise the floor of this team. So for that, I gave them a B. Then you had the Washington Nationals, who kind of did a similar thing. They didn't go get the superstar that changes the outlook of their team, but they did round out the roster fairly well. They did that trade with the Rangers for Nathaniel Lau and gave away Robert Garcia, who I think is fantastic, but Nathaniel Lyle's still a pretty good first baseman. You brought in Josh Bell, who, if he can look like prime Josh Bell, he's a great signing. Obviously, we know he has very low floors, high highs. Michael Soroka, Ahmed Rosario, Paul DeYoung, bunch of names, but those are your two headliners, was Lowe and Bell. And then you really only gave away Robert Garcia. You brought back Trevor Williams on a 2-year deal. It wasn't the greatest offseason, but I think they did improve slightly, so that's going to give them a B-. Then you had the Cincinnati Reds, who kind of felt like they spun in circles a little bit. Yes, they traded away Jonathan India, who felt like he's been the plug of this infield for a long time. You got back Brady Singer in that move, which should strengthen this rotation, and it should start to form a pretty good rotation, all things considered. But then you traded for Gavin Lux. I didn't really understand that move because it feels like you just got right back to where you started with having another second baseman type as your DH. Just didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Brought in Taylor Rogers. I love that move. Scott Barlow, that's a good addition as well. I gave him a B-, but this offseason has the potential to be a lot better down the road. And then you had the Chicago Cubs, who added a top 10 player in the game in Kyle Tucker to an already good team that finished above 500 last year. A lot of their offseason is predicated on that move. Yes, they brought in Ryan Presley, Justin Turner, Caleb Thielbar. There's some names, sure, but I think that's the name you have to hinge on. You cannot add a top 10 player in the game without really giving up that much. Yes, Cam Smith is going to be one that you're like, maybe he turns out to something great. But other than that, like they didn't really deal from that farm system all that much. They got rid of Isaac Paredes, who arguably was more of a detriment for them than a plus after they acquired him in the deadline last year. And then they can open up the door for a prospect like Matt Shaw at third. I think they did great this offseason, especially in that move for Kyle Tucker. For that, I gave them an A minus. And then for the Royals, it was a very steady, just solid offseason. You brought back Michael Walk on a 3-year deal. Michael Lorenzen back on a 1-year deal. Cole Reagan's got that extension on a 3-year deal. You traded for Jonathan India, which should lengthen this lineup quite a bit. You did lose Brady Singer in the process, but they have enough starting pitching that you can warrant that trade. Also got Carlos Esteves from the Phillies on a 2-year deal to help out this bullpen. I don't love that they didn't address the true needs of this team other than the addition of Jonathan India, but I would have liked to see them add more length to this lineup, add more quality bats, but at the end of the day, I like the moves that they made, so for that, I'm going to give them a B. For the Cardinals, it was a bad offseason. All offseason, it's been the rumors of tearing down, but they just didn't. And they didn't sign anybody. They signed Nick Anderson on a minor league deal, but at that point, what are we talking about? You only lost Paul Goldschmidt and Andrew Kittredge, so I didn't necessarily think it was the worst offseason, but it was pretty bad. I gave them a D. But oh man, I'm going to get excited again. You had the Boston Red Sox, who I felt clicked all the right buttons this offseason. You traded for Garrett Crochet, gave yourself an ace to that rotation right away. Hopefully he can lengthen out his time, get more innings under his belt next season at premier production. You have Alex Bregman, who is a money fit in Fenway. He's going to be fantastic there. Sucks that he has to play second, but it is what it is. You brought in Walker Buehler, who I am very bullish on this year. I think he'll do fantastic. He showed great things at the end of the season last year, and being a second-year removed from Tommy John surgery never hurts. Patrick Sandoval is going to come in the second half of the year, fresh off his injury. Hopefully he'll be back at full strength. And then you brought in Aroldis Chapman to help the bullpen. I would have liked to see them maybe add a couple more pieces there, but at the end of the day, I think they did fantastic, and for that, I gave them an A minus. For the Phillies, I was not nearly as impressed. I liked the move of Jesus Luzardo in exchange for Starlin Caba. I thought that was a pretty good move to help lengthen out this rotation. We already know the heavy hitters and Wheeler and Nola at the top, but then they also grabbed Jordan Romano, who you're hoping can bounce back, Max Kepler, who should provide some stability to that corner outfield spot, and then Joe Ross as well. Not the star-studded off seasons that we've seen in years prior, but they're definitely a team that didn't necessarily get worse. I don't love that they lost Jeff Hoffman and Carlos Esteves, so they kind of just were in the middle in terms of value lost, value added. For that, I gave them a C+. For the Giants, I was very puzzled by their offseason. You signed Willy Adames to the super long deal. Then you lose Blake Snell, which admittedly to the Dodgers, who are just handing out fistfuls of money. Yeah, sure, that makes sense. But it felt like you just kind of traded one player for the other in a sense. And you also lost Michael Conforto, Tyro Estrada, and Taylor Rogers in a really puzzling move. But you brought in Justin Verlander. Sure, I gave you a C+, but I don't love this offseason. Then you had the Miami Marlins, who, much like the Chicago White Sox from earlier, kind of just did what you needed to do. You traded Jake Berger to the Rangers, Jesus Luzardo to the Phillies, even got rid of Vidal Brujan, but in return, you didn't necessarily get the best haul. You got one top 100 prospect who's really far away from the majors in Starlin Caba. You also got back some MLB-ready guys from the Rangers, but it just wasn't an impressive return back. Then they also just didn't invest in the 1-year contracts that you saw the White Sox do that really kind of raised the floor to a team. Just wasn't a great offseason from my perspective, and for that, I gave them a C-. For the team that Jake Berger went to, we had the Texas Rangers, who I thought did pretty well, all things considered. You bring in Jake Berger to be your first baseman. Next thing you know, Nathaniel Lowe is exchangeable. You trade him for Robert Garcia, who's a great left-handed reliever, should be really improved next season. You also brought in Jock Peterson, re-signed Nathan Eovaldi. I thought it was a pretty good offseason. B+ from me. They did lose a couple names, but they did pretty well, all things considered. And then you had the Cleveland Guardians, who just had another Cleveland Guardians offseason. They did bring back Shane Bieber, which was a pretty big get for them, but they lost Andres Jimenez in that salary dump, traded Josh Naylor, got rid of Alex Cobb, Matthew Boyd, Miles Straw, Scott Barlow. You did bring in Carlos Santana to help fill that void at first base. You got Luis Ortiz whenever you acquired Spencer Horwitz for 5 minutes and then traded him to the Pirates. You also got in Paul Sewald, Jacob Junish, John Means. There's some names, but like at the end of the day, is this team better than last year? On paper, anyway, no, but it's the Guardians, so I'm sure they'll pull it out. But just strictly off their offseason, I'm going to give them a C minus. For the Twins, yeah, you didn't do a whole lot. You brought in Diego Cartaya from the Dodgers, great. Danny Colombi, Harrison Bader, Ty France, great. How this helps this team that much, I don't know. I'm going to give them a D. And then you have the Pittsburgh Pirates, my favorite team. Oh my goodness, what an offseason this was. You traded for Spencer Horwitz. This was a good move. He is dealing with some wrist issues right now, but he should be back relatively early in the season. They did give up Luis Ortiz in that move, which, they dealt from their strength. They have a plethora of starting pitching talent. Luis Ortiz, probably at the peak of his value last year. He performed great, but he probably did overperform to some degree. You brought in Caleb Ferguson, good left-hander reliever. You needed one of those because pretty much all of yours left in free agency. And then you signed Adam Frazier, Tommy Pham. And then to icing on the cake, you brought in Andrew Heaney to an already loaded pitching staff. Why? If you're going to be the Pirates and you're not going to spend money, why are you allocating the few dollars that you do spend to people that don't help the team? Tommy Pham's going to be your everyday left fielder, but do you want Tommy Pham as your everyday left fielder? Is he that much of an improvement over a guy like Billy Cook? I don't necessarily think so. He might be a great veteran piece, but that's what you're saying Andrew McCutchen is. I just don't get it. You look at what they lost as well. They lost Aroldis Chapman, who ended up being the de facto closer towards the end of the year. Brian De La Cruz, who, admittedly, that's okay. After the second half of the season, he had Connor Joe, whatever, Mike Leah Taylor, whatever. I gave him a D minus. I really wanted to give him an F, but gave him the D minus because there is one team that somehow outdid them. And that team was not the Arizona Diamondbacks. They brought in Corbin Burns on a massive 6-year deal. Great move by them, helped strengthen that starting pitching. You brought in Josh Naylor with the trade with the Cleveland Guardians. Wasn't necessarily Christian Walker, but it's close enough. You're not going to see that much of a difference. You did lose Christian Walker and Jock Peterson as your notable names in free agency, as well as Josh Bell and Paul Sewald. But you brought in Kendall Graveman and Seth Martinez. So they did well to band-aid what they lost. They brought in Corbin Burns, who I think is just a straight plus. So for that, I gave them a B. But it is the Seattle Mariners who outdid the Pirates and how bad they did, because this is a team that we all know what this starting rotation is. But we also know what this lineup isn't, and to aid that lineup, they brought in Donovan Solano, baby! What are we doing? What are we doing, guys? Come on. Spend some dollars and get a team that around Julio Rodriguez in this rotation, and you will have a playoff team every year so easily. But they just refuse to do it, so they're going to get the F of the video. But then to flip things on its head, we have the 1A plus of the video, the Los Angeles Dodgers. This one was pretty obvious, but let me tell you why. Blake Snell comes in, going to be a Cy Young candidate if he can stay healthy. Let's just call it what it is. Ha-Seong Kim, great audition from Korea. Michael Conforto, also great. But then you got Tanner Scott and Kirby Yates to this bullpen. That's disgusting. You brought in Roki Sasaki, the top prospect in all of baseball. But what makes this offseason so special is that they brought the band back together. Most of the time, whenever you see these World Series teams, they lose quite a bit to free agency. But you see Blake Trinan back, Teoscar Hernandez, Clayton Kershaw, even guys like Tommy Edman are getting paid, Enrique Hernandez. You did lose Walker Buehler. You did lose Gavin Lux and Jack Flaherty. But if that's what you're losing in an offseason like this, you can live with that. A plus on the board. Only one of the video. Congratulations to the Dodgers. Then you had their divisional rival, the San Diego Padres, who pretty much had a polar opposite free agency, went basically back in the way of the bad, only signed Nick Pivetta to a multi-year deal, a 4-year deal coming from Boston. He also signed Connor Joe and Jason Hayward to be that platoon option in left field in place of Jerks and Profar. But it's what you lost is what makes this offseason so poor for them. Obviously, you lost Jurickson Profar, but you also lost Tanner Scott, Hassan Kim, Kyle Higashioka, Martin Perez, Donovan Solano. Like, this team lost a lot. And then you add on to the fact that they weren't the same aggressors that they normally are in the offseason. They still have a good team, but they didn't make the supplemental additions that they normally make to keep pushing this team further. And for that, I gave them a D minus. And then you had the New York Mets, who had a great offseason, made the biggest signing of the offseason in Juan Soto, 15-year deal coming from the New York Yankees. But then you also added Clay Holmes, Jose Siri, Dylan Covey, even Frankie Montas, AJ Mentor. You also got the band back together like the Los Angeles Dodgers, re-signed Sean Manaea, Jesse Winker, Ryan Stanek, Pete Alonso, Drew Smith, and you only really lost Luis Severino and Harrison Bader. So, all things considered, I think this was a fantastic offseason. I could almost argue it was on par with the Dodgers, but I'm not going to quite go that far yet. But all things considered, it was a great, great offseason. I gave him an A, and that's going to do it. That's all 30 teams graded. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know this was a bit of a longer video. Comment down below where you guys' views maybe differed or were completely in sync with me. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and have a fantastic day.